We'll get started as more people continue to join. Hi, everyone. I'm Yuri Bogler with COO and co-founder of Project Pals. I'm going to be the one that's kind of hosting and sharing the screen throughout the presentation, but I do want everybody to introduce themselves. They'll be on this webinar. So first thing I'll do is share my screen. Can you guys see it, Miriam?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the topic today is equitably scaling project-based learning across a school or district. That's what we'll be discussing over the next hour or so, and we'll get into the agenda in a second. But before we do, just wanted to take a second for everyone to introduce themselves. So, John, if you could start.
Hi, I'm John Larmer, the editor-in-chief at PBLWorks, which is the new brand name of the Buck Institute for Education. So I'm glad to be here.
And I'm Brandon Wiley. I'm the Chief Program Officer at PBLWorks. Also a pleasure to be here.
Hi, I'm Miriam Bogler, and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Pals and a former technology teacher. And nice to be here.
And I'm Yuri Bogler, as I said before, CEO and co-founder at Project Pals. And our goal for this webinar is to equip administrators with actionable insights to scale project-based learning from pockets of innovation within a school or district to the entire organization. So we want to enable all students to participate in the transformative power of high-quality project-based learning. We hope that through this presentation, you guys get some actionable tips that you can take back to your districts, and try to put some of these things into action. Well, this is the agenda for today. We're going to start with John talking about project-based learning in the classrooms, kind of setting the table of what the gold standard PBL looks like within a class. Then we'll kind of scale it out, and Brandon, who works a lot on district level implementations and scaling efforts, will talk about how to take PBL from the classroom to scale across an organization. My experience is not in the classroom, it's more in corporate world, working in technology companies. So I'll be talking about project management in the workplace and some of the tools and tactics that are used in the workplace to help scale project-based work. And then how we brought some parallels from the workplace back to the classroom to do technology-infused PBL. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So just a little note here, there's a chat function within Zoom. If you look down on your menu, you should be able to see a chat. You can actually ask questions from within the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll be compiling the questions, and then we'll answer your questions in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. All right, so without any further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to John, who will walk us through some things around gold standard PBL.
All right, thanks, Yuri. All right, well, at PBLWorks, we are very focused on bringing high-quality project-based learning to all students. That's our mission. We think PBL works for all students, all subjects, all grade levels, all teachers, and all schools. So we're hoping to see it work especially effective, we think, for students who are furthest from educational opportunity. So let me go to the next slide, Yuri, and we'll give you our formal definition of project-based learning. It's a teaching method in which students gain knowledge and skills by working for an extended period of time to investigate and respond to an authentic, engaging, and complex question, problem, or challenge. So there's a lot in there, but let me just break it apart a little bit. It's about teaching content, that's important, 21st century success skills. It's not a short duration event, like we call them dessert projects you do at the end of a unit or on the side of a unit. It's the main course, it's like a curriculum unit. It's the main way you teach the content of the unit. And students are responding to something that is really interesting to them. It's authentic, real world, and complex, an open-ended question or a problem to solve or a challenge to meet. Okay, next slide. This is our model for gold standard PBL, and there's two parts. So the first part is the 7 essential project design elements. So with the center, the focus of the project are the learning goals, the key knowledge you want students to learn, standards-based content, or other curriculum guidelines you might have, deeper understanding of that content, and those 21st century success skills I mentioned, things like critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, communication, project management skills, self-management, and so forth. So there are 7 elements that every good project should have. Thanks, Yuri. 7 elements which are they can be sort of turned up or down. You don't have to have all these elements turned up all the way for every project, although we notice as teachers get more experience with project-based learning, they do find ways to bring all these 7 elements up at full strength into every project. But these elements are key to making it, as I said, a main course PBL unit, not just a dessert project that's kind of a fun activity but doesn't really reflect student important learning goals, or not a very rigorous activity. So there's a challenging problem or question that sort of starts off or frames the project. We call them driving questions that are open-ended, more than one possible right answer, or it could be a challenge statement or a problem statement. Sustained inquiry, which means students are asking questions, finding answers, finding different ways, different sources of information to answer their questions, and it's sustained. They get deeper and deeper, ask new questions, so they learn more information and get more resources. Authenticity, it's, as I said, real world. So that could be a simulation kind of project, which isn't fully authentic, but as long as it sort of, it puts students in a real world context. Like, for example, you are advisors to the president during World War II, should we drop the atom bomb on Japan? So that's kind of a simulation activity, but it's authentic because it really did happen, and it's the way the US government really works. Or it could be a fully authentic project, which is often the most powerful, where students are out in the real world, in their local community perhaps, solving real problems, investigating local issues, working with real world experts, using tools and making presentations in real world audiences and so forth. Student voice and choice, kids have a lot of choices in a project, not unlimited perhaps if they're new to PBL, but they can choose the way they work and who they work with perhaps, and what kind of products they'll create. Reflection throughout a project, not just at the end, but during a project, students are thinking about what they're learning and how they're learning and making adjustments along the way. There's critique and revision to improve their products during a project. Lots of formative assessment, feedback protocols. So students are learning how to give and receive good quality feedback to make them proud of their work at the end, because they're going to share it as a public product. And not just at the end of a project, but during a project. We think that students should be sharing their work, not just with their teacher, like traditional education is about, and with their peers, and also perhaps with outside experts or other students or the end users of their product. Like in design thinking, you've got to think about who are your end users. So students are getting feedback along the way. They're making their work public, not just at the end when they make a presentation or display their work or make it available to the final users or audience for their project. So those are the 7 elements of designing a good project. And then the next slide talks about the 7 project-based teaching practices in gold standard PBL. And this is the topic of a new book we wrote with ASCD just last fall, where we explore these 7 practices in more depth, a lot of it drawn from our own national faculty facilitators of our workshops. And there are, again, 7 practices. The learning goals are still at the center. That's what you're focused on. So designing and planning a project using those things I just showed you, the 7 essential design elements, and planning some of the details like arranging for the resources and planning your calendar. Aligning to standards, making sure it's, your projects are targeted the right things, the important standards, not just tangential ones or learning goals that are not as important. Build the culture, that's an important one, to make sure your students are feeling like they're in a healthy teamwork is going on, a collaborative culture. Students are sharing their work with each other, as I said, outside experts perhaps, or other audiences. There's kind of a healthy buzz in the room. You sort of know it when you see it or when you walk into a classroom. Students might be working independently, or should be as much as possible. It's not a teacher in the front of the room lecturing. It's that could happen still in a project, but a lot of the time you'll see students working independently in their teams. The teacher manages activities to make sure things are flowing well and deadlines are being met or workarounds are found, kind of like in a healthy workplace where project management skills keep things moving along. The teacher is scaffolding student learning to meet the needs of all students, making sure there's differentiation of students needed, and making sure that you're scaffolding all the right content and skills students need to produce good answers to that driving question and create high quality products. Assessing student learning takes place. As I said, a lot of formative assessment in PBL, and summative assessment also, the use of rubrics, performance-based assessments, and traditional assessments are used too, like traditional quizzes or tests or homework assignments can be used as long as they're in the context of the project. and finding engaging and coaching. The teachers are not always the sage on the stage. They're also alongside students, the guide on the side, sort of helping engage them in the work and seeing when they need help and encouraging them, celebrating successes, all the things a coach does. That's an important role for a teacher in a good project. So that's our gold standard model. And the next slide. Those are the two books I mentioned that are based on these, where we describe these two models, both co-published with ASCD, and they're available on our website. Okay. I mentioned dessert projects versus main course projects, and here's an example of that. I just want to really drive this point home because it's a big topic for us. We see a lot of these projects that are like this one, the Habitat Research and Diorama Project. So, you know, kids build a model of a rainforest or something here in this project, or a desert, or the mountains, or the tundra, whatever. So that's perhaps a good project. It's not a bad assignment, maybe. Kids have learned something from it, but it's not the main focus of the unit. It's not what really drives the learning. In this case, most of the learning for this unit on habitats probably came through more traditional instruction. And then the teacher said, okay, go build a model at home in a cardboard box of some habitat. And this is typical, or building models of you know, a pyramid for ancient Egypt, or there are all kinds of examples of these kind of projects, which they occur at the end of or alongside a unit. They're not the main way students learn. But what if this were the unit instead? The next slide, Jerry. So for the similar content can be taught in a unit by framing the whole thing with a project. And here's a real example from a school district near Detroit, where students Skyped with some staff members at the Detroit Zoo when they were told that some new animals were arriving and they needed to build some new habitats for these animals. So the students learned about the science behind that, habitats and these animals and what might be appropriate for them, and designed the habitats and got feedback from the zoo staff during the project. And they wrote proposals, so some language arts skills as well as science is being learned there, and created models for their habitats, and then shared them, made their work public in a final presentation to the zoo's education director. And actually, I think they actually went to the zoo in this case and were able to make the project, the presentation at the zoo itself, where they were questioned about what they learned and how they did their project. So that's an example of differentiating main course versus dessert projects. And next slide. Here's some more examples from different subject areas. I won't read them all out loud. You can see there different grades, different subjects. That top one, tiny houses, we have a good video about that on our website, a third grade project. But I've seen it done in high school too, where students actually build a house. That's really ambitious. And the third grade project, they just designed models and proposals for local residents. And you can see some of those are fully authentic, like podcasts from local veterans or prototypes for solar ovens in Haiti. And the mock legislature is a classic sort of more of a simulated project, but it still meets those gold standard criteria. And that last one is a good high school math project. Also a video on our website about that one. All right, next. Challenges for teachers in PBL. There are several, and I'll try to go over these quickly. The biggest one, what's why it's in capital letters, is time. Teachers always need more time, and with PBL especially, to learn a new practice, they're going to need time to plan together, because it really helps to plan together. Collaboration, both to get feedback from each other and exchange ideas and co-plan, co-teach perhaps the units if they can, and reflect after it's over to see what they've learned and plan their next projects. It's important to give up some control. So teachers, a lot of them are used to being in control of every minute of students' time in their classroom. And it takes a lot sometimes to sort of trust your students, trust the process that it's going to work. And you can give up some control and it's still going to work. So, and we advise teachers starting out to PBL, you can have your projects be more structured perhaps than later when students and you are more used to how to manage and work in a project-based environment. Managing the process can be a little scary for teachers. That's why I have this cartoon to the left there of a classroom a little out of control, not during a well-managed project, of course, but working in teams especially may be new for teachers and for students. So it's important to build their skills and build that culture, because that can be a real stumbling block. Finding real-world ideas, experts, outside organizations to work with. some teachers might have those connections, or their school can help make them happen for them, but it's difficult in some subjects to find those, but it's important to make those projects really authentic. Assessing those 21st century success skills may be a new thing for some teachers. How do you assess critical thinking or collaboration? So you can use rubrics for that purpose. We have some available on our website, and have students do self-assessment, peer assessment. Outside experts and other adults can help assess students and how well they're working together, and so forth. And Brandon will get more into this in his talk about how the system scales up PBL, but often those school and district requirements are a challenge for teachers, like the testing, the pressure of getting better test scores, and PBL can help improve test scores. It certainly won't hurt them if it's done well, but it's not it shouldn't be your prime strategy, say, for increasing your reading scores. It can be used to help give students motivation to read, but it's not like a literacy program. So we advise people to sort of keep those in place as well as project-based learning. But things like pacing guides, that can really kill a teacher's ability to do a project. They have to do things by a certain day and a certain week in a school year. There needs to be some flexibility for that, as well as the pressure that teachers feel they have to cover the content. Covering is not teaching. So we say, pick your important standards, go deep on those in your projects. You don't need to do projects all the time, all year long. You can mix it with other effective teaching methods. But trust that your test scores will be okay if you design projects and teach them well. And finally, school structures, the daily schedule. If teachers in a high school, say, have 6 periods a day of 15-minute classes, it's tough to do projects. So block scheduling works better. In an elementary school, having more flexible time helps. Class sizes, certainly if they're huge class sizes, that is a challenge for project-based learning. And just the isolation teachers often feel in their own classroom, their own subject area in secondary schools. It's important to break down those barriers, deprivatize your practice, plan together, teach together, and compare notes.
It's really, really good tips, John. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how teachers get to the gold standard. Like, what are some of the practices and things that you guys recommend at PBLWorks to help get teachers from not being comfortable with PBL to practicing the gold standard?
Well, let's see. We advise them to start without getting too ambitious. Like just at our PBL one-on-one workshop, for example, it's a 3-day workshop. They begin planning a project. We say, just implement that one project within 3 months, and we think you'll be successful. You and your students will like it, and then you'll be ready for your next project. Some people want to plunge in too far, too fast, or some school leaders sometimes say, we're going to go all PBL, or I want to do 5 projects this year. So don't jump in too fast. Learn the ropes first. And we think then over time, you'll find PBL works better and you can add more projects to your school year. So that's one piece of advice. It's okay to sort of reuse some of your existing lessons and units. So you might have a unit already that's a really great unit, and you can just add some of those gold standard PBL design elements to it to make it more authentic perhaps, or give it a public audience. And that will make some of your existing lessons and units into gold standard PBL. So you don't have to throw out everything you've done in the past. Start doing PBL. So there's 2 tips. Like one thing I should mention, I'll just reinforce that schools can really help teachers, I think, find those real world connections by forming partnerships, perhaps with local businesses, other organizations in the community, making sure people have good access, online access, good internet connections, perhaps to find experts in distant places and other organizations or schools to connect their students with.
No, that's great advice. And I think one more thing I'd love to ask too is about content. I mean, do you recommend when teachers are getting started with PBL to be developing their own projects, or to look at sources like PBLWorks and other places to find some pre-baked projects that they can get started with?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is easier for a lot of teachers, I think, to start with a pre-planned project designed by someone else. They can then adapt it for their own classroom. So we have some available on our site. You can find them elsewhere online too. Just make sure they are meeting those gold standard criteria, not a dessert project. But that's a good way to jumpstart your practice. But then some teachers really love designing their own curriculum. So that's okay too. But not everybody has the time or the inclination, or sometimes maybe, the idea is to start their own project. So jumpstarting it by adapting one you find is just fine.
All right. Great. Any other questions from, well, not the chat, we'll take those later in the QA. Anything else from Miriam or Brandon? All right, well, we'll move on to the next section. Thank you, John. We appreciate the insight on gold standard.
Okay.
And passing the mic over to Brandon.
Great. I think, thanks, John. I think your last slide tees up this next section really nicely about some of the challenges that teachers face. Both John and I, as former teachers, I think very deeply about what the lived experience is for teachers. And so the next two slides, this one and the next, are quotes that I think are illustrative of some of the challenges that teachers face. We've trained over 20,000 teachers last year in project-based learning, and we're continually, as a nonprofit and as a center that's trying to do research, understanding what's getting in the way and what is facilitating their ability to do high-quality project-based learning. And so this slide in particular talks about the need for longer blocks of instructional time. And maybe next slide you can go to, Yuri. And this slide speaks to the teacher's desire and need to be able to collaborate more effectively with their colleagues. To do this work well, it really requires, as John had number one on that slide, time for students to be able to engage meaningfully in projects, but just as much so the adults to be able to collaborate and work together to talk about the learning experiences they're creating for students. So when we were invited to participate in this webinar, I was giving it some real thought about the school systems across the United States that we're working in. And in many cases, what we've learned is that we've trained thousands and thousands of teachers who are really excited to go back to their classrooms and engage their students in projects. But unfortunately, many of them return to schools that are really not conducive or structured to allow them to do this type of learning with students. Or worse yet, they go back into school systems that have accountability measures and systems that actually are preferencing and valuing different outcomes than what project-based learning is really aiming towards. And I think it's really important to say that project-based learning is the vehicle by which we hope students will learn the key standards and content knowledge, but also the success skills that they'll need for college, career, and life. It's not the thing you do, to John's point about dessert. It's not something you do after the learning. It's the thing you do to help with the learning, to engage students in the learning. So if you go to the next slide, this sort of just shows that, in our opinion, what it really takes to scale project-based learning is to think of a sort of a nested approach, that it takes a systematic approach to really do this work well. And so at the center of all of this is really student learning. What are the specific things we are hoping students will know and be able to do when they leave our classrooms, when they graduate from our schools? And in what ways are the instructional approaches that we're taking actually getting kids to those outcomes? So in many cases, this is around evidence. Maybe you can hit it one more time. So in this case, really helping schools think about how are we collecting evidence of student learning that transcends and goes beyond test scores? That's really critical. Project-based learning is not necessarily the approach that's going to automatically raise your test scores. It will likely over time contribute to what students will need to know and be able to do on standardized tests. But just as importantly, it's going to allow them to engage in the real world, as John mentioned, develop the skills that they'll need to be successful, and work on some of the, what sometimes are referred to as non-cognitive skills. I don't know if I agree with that. I think there's a lot of thinking that goes into creative thinking and problem solving and so forth. But also for us, it's really been supporting schools and districts on sort of three levels. On the teacher level, it's helping to build their capacity to be able to design or adapt a project and be able to facilitate it well. So the two frameworks that John shared around the design and the teaching practices are very purposeful. It's not just about designing a whole bunch of projects. We also have to shift and think about the way in which we're delivering instruction. But if we just stop there and we train a bunch of teachers, or we support teachers with projects, and they go back into schools and systems that are not conducive for this type of learning, they're really going to sort of hit that glass ceiling. And so increasingly, we've been doing work with school and district leaders, and particularly with school leaders, helping them think about how are they putting the structures and the conditions in place that enable teachers to be able to do project-based learning deeply and well. And just as important, the ecosystem around the schools. How does the school district or system support them in a way? So that includes things like policy, funding, the autonomies that schools may need, whatever the accountability measure is, If we're not attending to those at the system level, then you will continue to have pockets of innovation where individual schools may be doing this work, but it doesn't get to a systemic approach where all schools within a school system are enabling this type of learning to happen. And just recently, we've been working a little bit more at the state agency level and trying to think about how does the state agency also sort of support and or enable these types of this type of learning to happen. So you can go to the next slide. To be more specific at the school level, there's really been a few things we've been really doing some research on and focusing on. And so if I were a school leader, for example, on this webinar right now, I would be thinking about these structures. One, do we have a clear vision, a real purpose for why we would even be doing project-based learning? What is our why for PBL? And so again, if we're really clear about what we want our kids to know and be able to do by the time they leave our hallways, then we should be able to answer the question, how will PBL help students achieve those outcomes? And in many cases, we're not really clear why we're doing PBL, just like one more thing. And that's why for some teachers, it feels like a fad or a passing venture. It really should be in service of reaching those outcomes. Do we have a culture that actually promotes and sustains the work that we want to do? So for example, if I work in a school where teachers do not have an opportunity to collaborate, we do not, as John said, deprivatize practice where we talk about teaching and learning, then project-based learning is much more challenging to do well when we're not sharing our sketch, we're not looking at student work, and we're not continually giving each other feedback about how we do this work. Are we building capacity of the adults in the building? So how are we helping teachers get better and practice PBL? Again, to John's point, if I get trained to do project-based learning, but I never go back into my classroom and implement that project, I'm not going to get better. So what are we doing to create expectations and structures to allow teachers to really do that work and do it in a way that's safe, where they can take some risks and they can be honest? Because the truth is, PBL is not always easy the first time out. And in some cases, the project you design doesn't play out the way in your classroom, the way you want it to. And so we want to be able to create a space where teachers can take some risk and try some new things. And lastly, that we're also thinking about continuous improvement. So in other words, how are there different feedback mechanisms in place within the school that allow us to kind of check in, see how it's going, see if we're getting the results that we had hoped, and if not, how do we course correct? And all four of these things, if you think of them sort of as an ongoing thought process for school and district leaders to be thinking about and to create the structures for teachers to do these things, it really also comes down to what we're kind of considering this underlying piece around infrastructure. How are we optimizing the resources we have in terms of time? So in some schools that we work with, they actually have quite a bit of planning time, but there's not a clear expectation for how to use that time. Or the same people meet all the time, and it doesn't give them a chance to do interdisciplinary or cross-grade level collaboration. Are we using our human capital well? Are there other people in the school or in the school community we could utilize? And then things like budget. Have we provided enough budget so that teachers who plan a project actually can go and get the resources that they need to potentially implement that project? So a lot of the work increasingly we've been doing to help schools and districts is to really look at the work through these different areas and to help them self-assess how they're doing and what more they could be doing to help scale PBL to more students and potentially to more schools within a system. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So one of the things we've been really pondering is, what does scale mean and what would it really take to get the outcomes that students need? And so lately what we've really been testing, and this is parts of some research that we're doing right now, is what would it take to ensure that all students, especially students furthest from opportunity, experience at least 2 high-quality project-based learning experiences each year. So what many schools do is they might say, we're going to train all of our teachers, and we're going to expect that every teacher is going to do PBL in our school. And in fact, we're going to set the expectation that they'll do 1 project in the fall and 1 project in the spring. Well, the good news about that is that you might have some common learning going on in your school among the adults, but I also think that that could be a lot for kids. If you think about every student, particularly at the high school level, if every one of their teachers is doing 2 high-quality projects, that's a lot of PBL. And for some kids, that's PBL fatigue. So what we want to be is more strategic, and we want to think about not what the adults are doing, but what the students are experiencing. And in this case, if the low bar is that every student each year experiences at least 2 high-quality projects, what would the multiplying effect be over the long haul of their career? How might they be able to practice and scaffold skills, but do it in a way that it's not so onerous or that they get fatigued from doing so many projects? Just this subtle shift of focusing on what students do versus what the adults do also allows you to think differently about how you train your teachers, how you support your teachers, and how you maintain the work, right? If I know that I have 50 teachers in my school, I'm going to train them all, and I have to support them all, that's a lot of work for me as a school leader. But if I know we're going to start with a smaller cohort of, let's say, a dozen teachers, and they're strategically selected across the school so that we can get the most bang for our buck in terms of students doing projects, that shifts the game a little bit in terms of how I can roll it out and how I can support those folks. So if you go to the next slide, this approach is really based on something called the diffusion of innovation theory. And really what this gets at, to make it very simple, is that all of us are more ready or less ready to implement innovations. So a real concrete example is I, for example, do not have Alexa or Google Home or any of those devices you talk to. I probably should. But like for me, I'm actually on the laggard end of the spectrum. I don't really see the purpose in the innovation just yet. Maybe I'm just not ready for it for a variety of reasons. And we kind of feel the same way that teachers are somewhere in this continuum of readiness based on the experience that they have, based on the past practices that they're used to using. There's a variety of reasons. And there's also no judgment. So I don't love the word laggard. That's the research term. But the reality is it just means that I'm further away from being ready to implement the innovation. So at this point, we're just thinking about where teachers are in their readiness and rolling things out in a more strategic way. You can go to the next slide. And so these are just a few ideas about how you might help teachers become more ready to engage in project-based learning. And I won't go through all these in great detail, other than to call it a couple of them. One, for example, I'll start at the bottom around observability. If teachers don't know what high-quality PBL looks like, and they've never experienced it as a learner, they're probably going to be less likely to take that first step. And so using things like videos, visiting classrooms that are doing project-based learning, these are all strategies you can use to help them see it. And for many of them, if they see it, they'll be more ready and more willing to try it. I think the tryability one is very interesting, again, about creating a safe space or a sandbox, if you will, for teachers to be able to try these practices. Or to John's point earlier, take a unit that they've already used in the past and think about how they can infuse some of the gold standard teaching practice pieces into that unit might be a way to do it. And the other one that I like to talk about is compatibility. How well does PBL fit with everything else you're doing? As a classroom teacher, I always felt my plate was very full and that this might be just one more thing on my plate. Instead, how do we look at PBL as sort of the plate in which all of these other things that we do fit into it, from classroom management to readers, writers workshop, to you name it, blended learning. You can infuse all of these different instructional strategies into a well-designed project. So instead of it being one more thing, it's something that's compatible with everything that we already do.
All right, that's great, Brandon. Really helpful information. And it's interesting how you guys are approaching the student-centered kind of how do you get 2 students to do 2 HQPBL projects a year, and how that might change the way that you go about distributing PBL support almost within your school, right? Is that kind of the theory that you guys are proposing here, that if you can reach them through maybe a segment of teachers as opposed to all teachers to get started, that might be the way to get innovation going within a school or within a district?
Yes, I mean, the first priority is really trying to better understand the student experience and have empathy for students and understand their needs. So that's the main driver of this, because my fear is when we train all teachers from the word go and we expect that everybody's going to be doing PBL, that actually has an impact on students who are, for example, working with multiple teachers. That could be a lot. That could be some PBL overload. But just as importantly as that student experience is thinking about the teacher experience. What's their readiness? What additional supports and scaffold do they need to feel successful? And there's only so much time and energy in a day. So trying to think about that more strategically is something that we've been playing with, and in some systems has been really successful. sort of that very intentional rollout.
Right, and it allows those, that continuum that you sort of showed of innovation, right? It allows those who are going to be more comfortable with innovation to kind of lead, and then those who are ready to come after to kind of come once some practices have been established and once students have had some experience with HQPBL, right?
Yes, because if you take it to that system level, you could play it out. Instead of talking about teachers, you could be talking about schools within a system.
Right.
So if I'm a district leader and I'm thinking about how do I scale this across my district, getting really clear about the readiness and where individual schools are. Some schools may already be doing this work, but they want to go deeper and they want to do it in a more holistic way. And then there are others that are just going to stick their big toe in the water. And so being able to sort of map out what that journey will look like and how the system would support schools over time, we think leads to a more sustainable model, but also ensures equity that everybody over time is going to have access to that type of learning.
No, that's fascinating. And I think it actually has a really good parallel into what I'm going to talk about next, which is really more about the workplace. And so, at this point, we'll kind of switch over to some of the slides that are more geared around Project Pals, which, just as an introduction for everybody, is an all-in-one platform to manage project-based learning. And as I mentioned in the intro, my experience is more in corporate, working in technology companies as a marketing leader, and someone who's managed a lot of teams to manage lots of projects in workplace. And I think, Brandon, to your point about some teachers being maybe the leads, right, of this type of teaching and instruction, right? In a corporation, not everybody's a project manager. Only some people are trained as project managers, and they have a lot of contributors that work underneath them that can then help get projects across the board. Not everybody is trained as that, and I think that it's a pretty similar parallel to what you're discussing here, where maybe not every teacher is a project manager. Maybe some are those managers, and then some end up maybe getting there at a later point. So what I wanted to really talk about was kind of some of the parallels of workplace projects to the classroom. So, why do employers value PBL, right? Because work is very much project-based. And I know this from firsthand experience, where really everything, whether it's a marketing campaign that has to get out the door, or, we need to do forecasting for how much we're going to sell over the course of the next year, whatever it is, there's all these projects that often require so many different stakeholders to be able to come together and do work. And so, the top 5 soft skills, this just came out a couple weeks ago from LinkedIn Learning this year, of what companies are looking for most in 2019, creativity, persuasion, collaboration, adaptability, all skills which are reinforced from project-based learning, and by doing more projects in the classroom. The reason they want people to have these skills is because one of the things that's a constant is change in the workplace. As technology is just changing the workplace left and right. My personal experience starting in marketing 15 years ago, we were very focused on print and television and radio. Those were the mediums that we cared very much about. And digital was like, you'd find the young kid to talk about digital. It was like this part of the budget. And now it's completely changed. And all of us marketers have had to adapt, right? That number 4, adaptability. We've had to relearn and be able to be open to learn new things so that we can now swim in a world of data, which has completely transformed the profession of marketing and continues to transform so many different professions out there. So I think the only constant that we know for the future of jobs is how much change there's going to be, and how we need to be able to get students to be open to become lifelong learners who can adapt to a rapidly changing environment. And I think this also adaptability, I want to point out just how important it is for students to learn how to fail forward, right? How, like, in what's happening in corporate world and the changes that happen, people are switching jobs 2 to 3 years. It's pretty common. Not many people stick around in the same workplace for 20, 30, 40 years like they used to. And with that comes some successes, great successes, but also some failures. And I think that the ability for students to weather that and to be able to emotionally have the social emotional skills to be able to deal with that failure and move on is something that a lot of employers are looking for. So, something about workplace is how do they scale projects across continents? And, how do Amazon and Facebook and smaller firms have stakeholders around the world that are working on collaborative projects and still are able to get the job done, right? How do they actually get this? How do they get everybody on the same page and make sure that stakeholders from different places around the world are all contributing in a cohesive project, getting things done on time to get the final product out the door? Well, they use a lot of project management software, right? It connects, this is an example of one that's very popular called Trello, but There's lots of project management software out there. It's the category itself is on its way to becoming a $7 billion category by 2025. So there's just, you cannot manage a project at the enterprise level without using some sort of project management software. It connects all the stakeholders, clearly showing who's going to do what. It takes the secret sauce out of collaborative work to an extent, because it really adds a lens of transparency and accountability to kind of break down tasks by person and allow everybody to be accountable and transparent with who's going to get what done and when. Almost so much so that, before I go to that slide, that in some cases, depending on how extensively the software is used, the project management platforms, managers can often just check software to see the status of a project without even having to pick up a phone, right? They can go and take a look and see, oh, we had a marketing campaign that was supposed to get out the door. There was some new, application update that was going to, that we were going to release for our mobile app. Why didn't it get out the door? They can go check and see, oh, creative is stuck on it. It's always creative, right? So they haven't hit their deadline yet. And you can go and you can see that without even having to go and dig deeper and talk to people. Of course, you can to get more context, but there's just a level of accountability and transparency that allows managers and executives to kind of see the processes and the workflows happening through this digital representation. And the parallels from the workplace to the classroom, in my opinion, having now been spending a lot more time in the classroom since becoming involved in the education sector in Project PALS, I can definitely see a lot of parallels that CEOs and executives are obviously like the leaders at the school and district level. Project managers are like the teachers, in my opinion, in many cases. And I think to Brandon's point, maybe not all teachers need to be project managers, but still I see a big, in terms of doing project-based learning, when you're not the stage on the stage, when you're more the facilitator, that really is acting as kind of more of a project manager in a workplace. And then the team members within the workplace are really like the students, right? They're the collaborators. They're the ones who are actually going out there and doing the work under the supervision and guidance of a project manager who might put together the scope of the project and who's going to do what when. But the team members are often the ones that are out there going and doing the execution. They're doing the research, they're doing the creative, they're putting together their models, they're doing the coding, etc. And so I really think that parallel can help us think about how technology can be infused more in the platform for project-based learning to create more transparency. So that's similar, example of a CEO being able to check some software and see what's the status of a project. We would hope that by using platform and technology, school leaders, district leaders, project managers like teachers can get a better sense organizationally of the status of projects. Are the students working on the project at the pace that I would expect? What is the quality of the work that's coming out of it? And being able to see that in a more accessible fashion than needing to go and check in kind of with groups physically all the time. Because if you're managing, if you have 125 students that you're responsible for, they're working in small teams, that's a lot of projects to manage concurrently, more so than what project managers are often used to in corporations, and those are project managers that have been trained in project management. And so I do think that the use of technology can help scale this for teachers to become a little easier to administer. As John mentioned, one of the challenges is kind of managing all these moving pieces. And so, right now, the technology isn't necessarily standardized in project-based learning. Implementation of PBL varies dramatically by teacher. There's a lot of pen and paper, poster boards. Google sometimes is brought in, Microsoft Office, and then obviously, still a lot, like sticky notes and kind of design thinking assets. So the materials and medium can really vary from teacher to teacher and classroom to classroom. We believe that the varying approaches sometimes can lead to some varying results in that, that there's not a standard sort of protocol or technology to help kind of show, to help standardize the project management process. So in our opinion, platform is one of the missing ingredients to equitably scale high quality project-based learning, similar to how platform has helped corporations scale project-based work across continents. If Amazon was using pen and paper to manage its projects, they wouldn't be able to do the amazing things that they're getting done. And so that thing that, what's happened already in the corporate world, we think is going to make its way into the classroom, whether it's Project PALS or other applications and platforms out there. This technology that's helping teams collaborate around the world, can help students collaborate within a classroom, and can also, help teachers manage projects across multiple classes concurrently. At this point, I'll pass the microphone over to Miriam Bogler, who we don't just share a name by accident. She is my mom. This Project Pals is a family business, and so she will tell you about her story as a classroom who infused technology into her instruction over the course of her career.
So basically, as you heard, I've been a computer teacher for more than 2 decades. And almost from the beginning, almost from the 90s, I knew the Buck Institute because that was my source for project-based learning. I learned a lot from that, and that was the way that I designed the project for, that was the way that I designed these projects that I wanted students to create. In my time, we had a computer lab, so students would come to a computer lab to work on projects. And what I noticed as they were working on projects that they really had difficulty doing investigative work. They usually treated these projects as like a question and answer situation. So knowing that we are in the 21st century and that the skills that employers today value are critical thinking and problem solving, I understood that we need to work on this and maybe create some type of a solution where it's going to be easier for students to do investigations. At the time, I worked with software like Microworlds, HyperCard, and Macromedia, and that kind of inspired me to focus on project-based learning. Later on, started working. I was one of the first adopters of Google Apps, and I actually helped 2 schools to install Google Apps I thought that Google Apps at the time was an amazing tool because of its capability for collaboration, and also because what Yuri was talking about, that the platform is the missing part. Actually, that provided me that platform. In my eyes, even though there were a lot of apps separate, I was able to create projects using Google Sites and embedding into Google Sites the other applications. So projects, for example, examples of project would be like one that was created by one of my classes, the Virginia Colony, where students actually wrote about the colony, but they also embedded into it Google Sheets and Google Forms. And so they were doing like adding questions by creating a form and typing in their question, and that was accumulated in a Google Sheet. And so basically the reason for doing that was that way students were able to see not only the detail, to write on not only the detail, but see the big picture. And in addition to that, they were able to collaborate. So all of them were able to see what the other students were doing. This was kind of a preview for Project Pals that later I created, but that was my way of simulating that type of environment. Here I created for you guys a list. I actually gathered this from the Consortium of School Networking, a list of applications that you can look at and use to do problem and project-based learning. And then finally, really what pushed me.
I forgot to mention too, real quick, you didn't, about this list and all these slides. We'll be sending a recording of the webinar and the slides after the webinar tomorrow, so you guys will have all this access to this if you want to look into any of these platforms.
And finally, what really pushed me to create Project Pals was, in addition to teaching technology, teaching technology, I was also teaching robotics, of course. And this was an LAUSD Title I school, and students were requested. And what happened here is that students started building their robot using blueprints, And when they finished the whole entire process, suddenly I realized that they really don't understand what they were doing. So what I decided to do is, and they were also coming, and they was also coming to me and telling me that they would like to to build a robot that will go faster, or they would like to build a robot that will climb an incline. So I realized that in order for them to be able to do all these things, they need to actually understand those underlying concepts, like what are gears and what is torque, and therefore I decided to again create that type of platform from them by using a FileMaker Pro database. And so I broke down the entire process into 4 phases: design, construction, programming, and investigation. And using the database, students were able to actually start building the robot and constantly go back and forth and iterate whenever they would have a problem or something that didn't go well. They were able to actually write about it, go back to the database and check again what they did previously, how they can improve on it. In addition to that, other teams were able to also go and check how other teams have tackled these situations and learn from them. So it turned out to be a huge success. And these students who have never been accustomed to thinking that they will be able to go to university suddenly started thinking about becoming engineers. And in addition to that, whenever the class would end, they never wanted to go back home. So that was a huge success for me. So as I said, this was the precursor for building Project Pals. And what I really learned from this robotics class was that students can gain from understanding those underlying concepts and from seeing not only the detail, but also the big picture in any subject, not just in robotics. And that was really the thing that pushed me to develop Project Pals. And I'm gonna...
This is where I'll just jump in real quick to say that basically the Project Pals, without getting too into the application, but it's an application to manage collaborative learning in projects where you can actually create your own library of projects assigned to students. Students will actually do the collaborative work within the platform. So there's a catalog of pre-made projects, including like the Student Podcast Challenge, which we adapted from the Buck Institute and NPR. And you can actually assign the projects down to your students. So we took a lot of their scaffolds from their podcast challenge, put it into this digital whiteboarding space, which is updated in real time, which guides students through learning about podcasting, coming up with a podcast script. And we have a lot of projects that span the gamut of different subjects, including innovation, how to create an innovation. You assign it down to a class, students would actually start their projects and manage their collaboration right within the class. And then you get statistics to see how much did each team work on the project, and you can pace the teams against each other to see who's on pace and who's behind. And you can even drill down to see individual student contribution in the group project, culminating in the ability to apply all that data to a rubric evaluation, which you can create your own rubrics or use our own default rubrics and do end-to-end project management within the tool. So really our reason for doing Project Pals and why we think technology, whether it's Google, Microsoft, or any of the other technology that's out there, Trello to help manage projects or Project Pals, all these things, or using different ones for different purposes, they all help, again, kind of streamline workflow and add and increase accountability and transparency so that all the stakeholders in the project can kind of see what's happening. And teachers can also share and learn from each other through digital, so they don't have to necessarily be physically in the classroom to model and learn from another teacher. Rather, they can share some of these digital assets, maybe even share a project and assign the project and co-teach a class together. And that's kind of how technology can help scale this. So at this time, I'll open up for questions. I haven't seen any questions yet come through the chat. If there's any questions, please feel free to type them in there. Brandon or John, any questions on anything that we kind of covered about technology and its application in project-based learning?
I just want to commend you. I feel like one of the things that John mentioned that we're learning is that we want teachers to be designers of the learning experiences in their classrooms, but where they start, I think, is the part that we're still trying to better understand. Do they have to start from ground zero, or can they take an existing project? And I think what technology does is it enables them to not only find projects like these, but also to be able to collaborate with other teachers who are also, implementing those projects in their classroom, potentially allowing their their students to collaborate on those projects together. It just takes project-based learning to a really 3- and 4-dimensional world, and can accelerate it a lot more quickly.
Yuri, I really like the feature of your platform where you can track what student teams are doing and how individual students are doing. Now, do students use that as well, or just teachers?
Do students use the actual? You can
do they actually keep track of their progress on Project Pals?
Yeah, yes. You can. It's a modular setting, so it depends on. Some teachers deem that as maybe being competitive, and so if they want to turn off the statistics for students, they can. Where basically only the teacher has access, but the default is that both teachers and students have access to the data, and that's actually a motivator for students to sort of do their part, right? So that the work is more represented equally amongst the team.
That's great.
And I would say, Brandon, to your point, also one of the things that I noticed in working in corporations and enterprises was having the project management software also allowed us to map out what the process was. Like a marketing campaign is a marketing campaign. So the process of a marketing campaign is the same almost always, even if the subject matter changes from campaign to campaign. Having that project management software to map out the process allowed it so that if we had turnover, if someone left the company or got promoted, somebody else could walk into that role and be able to take over with a nice blueprint of how this project was going to go. And I think that that's one of the things that hopefully technology can do for PBL in the classroom is it's make it a little less teacher specific. So if a teacher leaves the school or gets promoted to administration, that all of that knowledge and all those projects don't disappear with the teacher, but there's some record there for other teachers to take over and kind of, pass the baton.
And not only that, can I add for a minute, it also serves as a portfolio for the student, and they can even take it from institution to institution. So basically the projects stay and they can see them and accumulate work throughout the year. So,
and definitely technology is not the only answer. I think a lot of the things that Brandon and obviously, and John and what PBLWorks offers in terms of the professional development and, changing systems, all those things have to be in place. But we just think technology is another enhancement to kind of help document and help scale this effort in addition to all the other, all the other elements that make it successful. I do see a question here from Susan Armstrong. How can we set up a live demo? Yeah, so if there's questions about Project Pals, you can reach out. We'll make sure that in our email with the YouTube, with the recording of the webinar and the slides, that will also have contact information for us and all the participants in this webinar. And if there's questions about, more information about Project Pals, feel free to reach out to Miriam or myself. And certainly if there's questions or you want more information from PBLWorks about the services that they provide, whether that's professional development or otherwise, we recommend you guys reach out to them directly as well. Any other questions before we wrap this up? All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time, and look out for an email from us. Oh, another question. Sorry, I was going to outro it, but a little premature. Do you have any tips for schools located in non-English speaking countries where projects are conducted in English? That is a good question. Let me open that up to Brandon or John real quick before we chime in on it. Any thoughts on projects?
Well, for us to be really transparent, this is still a bit of a challenge. So many of our resources are primarily in English. We're getting increasing requests for not only projects, but just our resources to be translated to other languages. We're actively looking at how to do that and do that well. But increasingly, for us, we have some resources, for example, that are in Spanish. Some of our work has been translated to Chinese. John, I know you were recently in China where there was a big demand for this, but it's an area for growth for us as an organization, and hopefully more to come soon.
Yeah, and if projects are conducted in English, then the students are kind of in the role of English as a foreign language. So that's interesting. A lot of the same tips might apply to teachers of world languages here in the United States, for example, teachers of French or Spanish and so forth. We have a couple of blogs on that topic. If you look through our blogs on English learners, and I think we even have one about English as a foreign language. So do a search on our blog, you might find some examples.
And in terms of the Project Pals, what we've been having some usage overseas as well, and we have projects occurring in English in non-English speaking countries. And basically what we've seen is that, you can, at least in our platform, you can write in whatever language you want within that workspace. So right now we do have projects that are occurring in English and Spanish and a few other languages as well. You can also, one of the nice things about scaffolding these digital projects and assigning them down to your classes is you can create one version of a project that's, has a lot of scaffold and one that might have less scaffolds, or one that's in English and one that's in Spanish, and they can be carbon copies of each other. And then you can assign them down to your class and have different groups of students start the projects based off of their specific language needs. So we allow for that kind of differentiation by being able to assign variations of the same project with different scaffolds based on the student needs specifically.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool.
I think
any other questions?
yeah, there's another question, I think.
That was just a great thanks. Well, thank you for asking a great question. And we will wrap this up now. Of course, you can reach out to us afterwards with additional questions. We'll provide our contact information. Once again, thank you so much to John, to Brandon for joining us today at PBLWorks. Really, they've been shepherding PBL for as long as PBL's been PBL. So we just really appreciate your guys' work and your mission, and we're so happy to be part of the mission of trying to scale project-based learning for more learners out there so they can experience the transformative power of this learning. So thank you guys.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
And to all the administrators, thank you guys for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, Yuri.